friends are since. Over the past few weeks, I have been preparing for my grand return to the world of live electronic music for the first time actually since before the pandemic. And as part of that, I've been trying to figure out what kind of hardware setup I could take that would mean that I wasn't just using a laptop with Ableton, because no offense to anybody that does that, it takes a great deal of skill to play live, you know, whatever the setup. However, that kind of thing just doesn't excite me all that much, so I wanted to do something a wee bit different. For that reason, I've decided that at least in the near term, I'm going to be playing live with the Dirtywave M8. There's a couple of reasons for this. The first one being simply that a lot of the songs that I've written recently that I really like, and I think would translate quite well in a live environment, have been written on the Dirtywave M8, and so everything's already in there and it's, you know, good and ready to go. The second reason is that when I've played live in the past, I've often done so with LSDJ on the Game Boy, and a lot of the way that you play live on the Game Boy has kind of been ported over onto the Dirtywave M8, so I'm very comfortable with how everything works and what I need to do in order to get what I need and all that kind of thing. Now, the big challenge of playing live with the Game Boy and now the Dirtywave M8 has always been how to make things a bit more engaging, because otherwise it's very easy to just end up in the position where you're just standing there with a wee device in your face and no one really knows what the fuck you're doing or what is going on. And actually, in many ways, that is probably worse than playing on a laptop. And people try all sorts of things to kind of spice things up. And from my perspective, I tried a whole variety of, you know, interesting tactics, including things like, you know, dancing about on stage wearing a mask, or, you know, having live visuals or whatever it might be. But aside from the performative elements, there's a bunch of stuff I did with the audio and kind of, you know, single path and all that kind of thing to try and break things out of the Game Boy a wee bit. And actually some of them were the reason that I started this channel in the first place. For example, running the audio from the Game Boy through different guitar effects pedals, or using something like the Chaos Pad, the KP3, which means you can really kind of perform on it with its touch screen. The other thing that I really enjoyed doing with the Game Boy when playing live was sending MIDI data out from LSDJ into something like a drum machine, or, you know, a kick drum module like the Vermona Kick, to really beef up the sound, but also so that I had a bit more gear on stage that I could kind of play live with and not always be stuck using the Game Boy. And actually I blame all of that for my descent into the mad world of synthesizers. Now, both the Game Boy and the Dirtywave M8 have only got a single stereo audio output as standard, and as a result it means you can't really route different tracks to different outputs for separate processing. So if you are going to apply effects in a chain like that, they're going to be applied to the entire song, which isn't, you know, ideal. It means you have to be really judicious about the type and depth of effect you're using, but also the timing of when you use the effect, and it can be really quite limiting indeed. However, the Dirtywave M8 has got a whole bunch of added functionality, which means that you can kind of control different elements of it separately, and it really opens up that kind of world of live performance. And I demonstrated fairly recently in a video how you could use an external MIDI controller to vary different parameters within the M8, such as oscillator types or effect sends or whatever it might be, but you could also do that at an instrument level, which means you get really kind of granular control, and it opens things up and gives you much more scope for being performative. For this very reason, I have been experimenting for a while with different types of MIDI controllers to be used with the Dirtywave M8, including these wee beautiful devices from intech.studio. These are kind of portable, powerful, modular MIDI controller devices that you can customize and, you know, kind of build up and clip together in a way that suits your specific setup. And I think these are particularly good for the M8, or, you know, they marry the M8 quite nicely because of their size, and just look at them, they look beautiful. However, for this particular gig that I've got coming up this weekend, it's going to be in a field somewhere. I'm almost certainly going to be very drunk. There'll be beer and mud and all that kind of thing, and I didn't quite want to risk these just yet in the live environment. So I decided that I was going to go with an old trusty faithful companion, also because it has one specific feature in it which makes it extremely useful for live performance in this way. And I'm talking about, of course, the battered old Behringer BCF2000. If you're not familiar with the BCF2000 already, it is this big chunky old MIDI controller that has got a variety of different buttons and encoders, but most importantly it's got motorized faders, and I'll explain why that's important in a wee minute. So with the BCF2000, what I've done is along the top row where you can see the encoders here, the first two I have assigned to the DJ filter, the frequency cutoff and also the resonance, I believe. And then the other knobs that are up there are assigned to specific instruments effects sends. So for example, the lead sounds delay send, so that when I'm in the middle of rocking out and all that, I can dial up the delay and let it ring out or whatever it might be, just to give a bit more variation in the sound in that kind of live way. Now underneath there's a row of buttons, and what I've done with them is assign them to the default values of each individual parameter. So for example, let's say I'm going mad and I'm in a wild drunken haze. I turn up the delay so loud in one of the instruments that it's feedbacking out and I can't figure out how to get it back to the value that I need it to be. If I press the button, bam, it'll reset the value and save the day. It's kind of like my escape button, really. Rather conveniently, the Dirtywave M8 has got 8 tracks and the BCF2000 has got 8 faders. So my plan was to assign a fader to the corresponding track within the M8, and that would give me some more hands-on control over the individual volume of different elements within the song. Now in theory this works great, and also in practice it worked out fairly well until I changed song, because obviously between songs the different volumes of each track will be different, but the faders themselves won't have moved. So if you go to move the fader on your second song and the position hasn't changed but the values have within the M8, then you're going to get quite a big jump when you go to adjust things, which is not what you want in a live environment. Now this is where the importance of the motorized faders of the BCF2000 in particular come in handy, because what you can do is send MIDI data to the faders on this device, which will then move them to the corresponding position. So on the BCF you can set up different programs or scenes, and my hope was that I'd be able to, you know, move the sliders and encoders into the respective positions for the songs and then save a program for each song. That would mean that all I would have to do is send a MIDI program change message from the Dirtywave M8 to the BCF each time I change song, and everything would move into position. However, unfortunately, for whatever reason, the BCF doesn't store the position of the faders with the programs, which is who knows why that isn't the case. And so what I've had to do is set up each individual song on the M8 to send out the MIDI data for each individual parameter and each individual control at the start of each song. Now, this took a lot longer than I expected it to, partly because of the calculations I had to make. Like many other trackers, the Dirtywave M8 operates on a hexadecimal numbering system, which I think tops out at something like 255 is the max value. And this means that if you want to send out MIDI CC commands, you do need to do a wee bit of calculation to find the correct hex value, because not only is MIDI CC in decimal, but it's also at something like 127 as a max value. Because 127 is kind of half of 255 roughly, I had to take the hex value of the original parameter that I wanted to control, I had to convert that into decimal, I had to half it, I then had to convert it back into hex so that I knew what value to send from the Dirtywave M8. And I had to do this for every single parameter I wanted to control in every single song, which was, to put it mildly, a bit of a fucking nightmare. After hours of work, I managed to do this, and I can't tell you the joy I experienced when I tested everything out and it was all working beautifully and I could load up a new song and everything would shift into position. It took a bit of brain power to figure all of that out, and so what I've done is uploaded a kind of example of this onto my Patreon. So if you're curious about this kind of setup, you can go and look and see what I've done and maybe get inspiration for your own setup if you want to be as foolish enough to try this. Going forward, obviously this should hopefully be a bit easier, because whenever I write a song now in the Dirtywave M8, I'll just include this MIDI data as standard in at the top of my template, and I'll just have to adjust a few values depending on the particular instrument or anything. But it does mean that if I want to change the track volume or the starting value of any of the parameters within a song, then I'll have to recalculate everything, which is a bit of a nightmare. So hopefully, maybe one day there will be MIDI feedback within the M8. I'll be road testing this very soon, so I guess we'll see how it works out. If you've got any questions about this in particular, feel free to ask. I largely wanted to share because it took me so fucking long to do this that I thought I should be able to get something out of it. For now, see you later.